Uma conversa. Gravada.
Kleber Mendonça Filho first came to prominence as a filmmaker through 2012's Neighbouring Sounds and 2016's Aquarius. Leisurely character-based dramas that explored themes of class, the intersection of authority and capital, how history shapes our surroundings and in turn our surroundings shape us. And followed that up in conjunction with co-writer and director Juliana Dornelles with Bacurau, a dystopian neo-western Mad Max if it were directed by Robert Altman, a fierce repudiation of a Brazil that seemed to be backsliding into authoritarianism, skewed through with a biting anti-colonialist allegory of violence and erasure. All of these films are brilliant in their own ways. My genre leaning certainly draw me towards Bacurau the most. But I will also say that Sonia Braga is phenomenal in Aquarius. An absolute tour de force of a performance as a fierce survivor who won't let go of her personal history without a fight. But 2025's O Agente Secreto, or The Secret Agent, is Mendonça Filho's best narrative feature to date. His most assured and textured work both in terms of filmmaking craft and in how the themes from his earlier films flow into this one. The Secret Agent centers on Armando, an ordinary man navigating a Brazil in the midst of a military dictatorship, brilliantly brought to life in a subtle yet masterful performance from Wagner Moura. His Armando is still C masking internal tumult, more confident and relaxed in flashback, his natural charisma to the fore, while in the primary strand he is cowed, guarded, suspicious, someone largely seeking to fade into the background, the weight on his shoulders both the boot heel of the state and his own past. Moura often giving way to bigger performances, a skill in itself, shrinking into his own skin alongside Roberio Diogenes' ghoulish overbearing bully Euclid, or becoming an entertained audience for the spectacular Tania Maria as Donna Sebastiana, an angel of mercy named after an angel of death, perfectly balancing exuberance and earthiness. The cherry on top of his wonderful performance is a brief cameo as Armando's son, Fernando, 40 years hence, Moura modulating his body language and even gait, retaining elements of his father's easy charm, but nevertheless conveying a completely different person who just happens to have the same face. Mendonça Filho's camera loiters through scenes largely naturalistic, the detached and unobtrusive style seen throughout his narrative pictures, more concerned with the moments in between than rushing towards plot beats and resolutions. His camera a passive observer to tragedy, heightening the disconnect between what we are watching and the film's ironic title. Mendonça Filho commits so fully to stoically shadowing this lone domino, fleeing the vast cascade of history, that an audience is, for much of the film, intentionally left wondering what they are following and why, itself enough of a point, that there really doesn't need to be a reason. Existing in a corrupt authoritarian dictatorship can find you in danger for having a clean car in a rural petrol station. When the exposition does come an hour and 10 minutes into the film, it's not some grand conspiracy. Armando isn't a vital chess piece in a bold gambit that will bring the whole corrupt system down, those guilty to pay a hefty price. His whole life has been brought crashing down around him because some petty and corrupt arsehole wanted to get a bit richer and didn't like how long his hair was. And that's really all it takes, when there are no barriers for the wealthy and the powerful, when violence surrounds you like the air you breathe. This is not a story of the grand sweep of history, of a myth or an inflection point. It's the story of one man, and even then just a fragment, a yellowing snapshot capturing a fleeting moment, reflecting how this man spoke and how others spoke of him. In fact, literally so. Mendonça Filho employing a framing device which discloses that the core narrative is essentially a representation of audio testimony from the 1970s, being transcribed by a university researcher in 2020. It is a manifestation of history from below, of centering the humanity of the tales of our past, seeking to represent the truth of a man slandered, barely a memory, a record of someone erased, an exemplar of all those similarly forgotten. But Mendonça Filho is also unafraid to break this spell, dipping into genre styling when it's called for, as with the brilliantly constructed finale to Armando's narrative, tense and gripping, skillfully aping spy cinema, before exploding into Peckinpah-inspired violence. This is emblematic of a certain playfulness to the film, a time of mischief indeed, not historical drama in the sense that it follows a true story of life under Brazil's military dictatorship, which could perhaps have been somewhat redundant after Walter Salles' brilliant 2024 feature I'm Still Here, a film pregnant with history, the story of Eunice Piver adapted from her son's memoir, the brutality of the Medici regime seen through her eyes, as it invades her home, slices through her family, plunges her into a labyrinthine Kafkaesque nightmare, telling as well as showing, from contemporary news reports to dialogue spelling out the violence and corruption of the state, A sledgehammer of a film that still manages to foreground humanity and how it perseveres, anchored by a brilliant performance from Fernando Torres. By contrast, in The Secret Agent, Mendonça Filho doesn't directly address the state at all, using the freedom of a fictionalized narrative to widen his scope even in narrowing his focus, to tease broader systemic issues into his narrative. Plot beats draw from the real, electric cars, lithium batteries, somewhat esoteric research which gained attention due to the oil crises of the 1970s, while Luciano Caroli's corrupt capitalist Enrique Girotti functions as both an amalgam of real figures from the period and a representation of the way capital was intertwined with that military dictatorship. At this intersection between fact and fiction, we find a film that is very much about the in-between, the space between a life lived and death, Recife becoming a limbo for our main character, drawn to that limbo precisely because it represents his past and his future, reaching back for tangible evidence of the existence of his mother, while yearning for a life with his son. Or the space between dictatorship and democratization, the film set 2 years after the end of the Medici regime, but still almost a decade from parliamentary elections in 1986, an in-between period known as distanciao, or political decompression, the country struggling through the oil crises of the 70s but not yet plunged into the crippling debt crisis of the 80s, the weight of the before meeting the knowledge of how far there is yet to go, the film bulging with the uncertainty of historical liminal spaces, a literal Yanis-Kate symbolic lampshade of transition of the in-between. Or between myth and reality like Perna Cabeluda, the hairy leg of Recife, brought to grisly life in one of the most show-stopping scenes in the film, a comedic slab of slapstick ultra-violence, juxtaposed with characters laughing maniacally at the ludicrousness of the story they are reading in one of the ubiquitous newspapers. Apart from the one character who knows what this is. The hairy leg of Recife is, according to Mendonça Filho, legitimately how one local paper was reporting on police brutality and state oppression at the time, the only way they could and not feel its boot on their neck themselves. Myth the only way to safely record even a fragment of the truth. Just as this picture of 1970s Brazil is itself a myth, a fiction, but at the same time true, drawn from the lived experience of Mendonça Filho, the testimony of those who survived a brutal regime, and the ones closest to those who didn't, the weight of history, the canvas on which its tale is painted, a sweaty tableau seeping through and staining the narrative brushstrokes dabbed on top. Paintings of Christ on the wall of Donna Sebastiana's safe house give way to pictures of notable figures of the era prominently displayed across state buildings, a deft illustration of how dictatorship and authoritarianism demand worship. Power rooted in portrayal, leaders meant to be respected, deified, followed, and feared, and how their mythology hovers above every action, that this world is their construction. Even without directly acting themselves, they are responsible. We don't need scenes of the powerful barking orders. This is a story of how their evil courses through to the very fingertips of society, omnipresently felt if only seen through iconography, the mundane becoming perilous when corruption and violence are ubiquitous. In the opening seconds of The Secret Agent, we are introduced to corrupt rural police, ignoring crime in favor of an unsubtle shakedown, while the police in the city are even worse, little more than gangsters, terrorizing those they should be protecting as if it were a game, thugs to whom people are either numbers or meat, their only deference not to justice, but to capital, protecting the wealthy when they do wrong, terrorizing the poor because they can. Their brothers in arms, hitmen, embraced and enabled, a shared military background showing that these are seeds of the same rotten fruit, state police or hired gun, the sole difference being how blatant you can be and how much paperwork there is to do. There's also the point here that this isn't directly state oppression. This is murder as private enterprise, bought and paid for twice over, retribution subcontracted and subcontracted again, a literal savage capitalism corroding humanity, violence and lawlessness facilitated and condoned by the state, so long as it's meted out to the right targets, authoritarianism and capital enabling each other, so firmly enmeshed as to be effectively indistinguishable. This decay extends beyond the state itself, rot spreading through society, when this is the environment, when the suffocating humidity of oppression clouds every moment of your life. All you can do is try to survive, not just those who find themselves directly under threat, but a culture of paranoia and self-interest that pervades through society. You don't need to actually believe all the bullshit to sell out someone for a handful of Cruzeiro, even if it helps. You just need to believe the alternative is worse for you, if not them. And moreover, you have to believe that they'd sell you out first. Trust and solidarity laying dead in the street, as sure as any rowdy dissident. Perhaps even more interestingly, where the mythology of the regime is initially presented as largely flavor, a literal backdrop, Mendonça Filho also uses it to draw you towards his authorial voice, as Armando's story reaches its tense bottleneck, lingering on these portraits, then almost breaking the fourth wall for a visual gag amid the mounting tension, a portrait of then-President Ernesto Gezo, hanging prominently on a wall otherwise dedicated to swindlers and con artists. Which is honestly chef's kiss. Or similarly lingering on a newspaper story about newly sworn-in President Jimmy Carter's attempts to bring peace to the Middle East, skewering the hopefulness of late 70s America with the power of dramatic hindsight, that Carter's initial drive for a more humanitarian foreign policy has long since faded, a small outpost in a sea of different manners of colonialism. And there is something confident about a filmmaker being willing to drag you away from their narrative, to invite you to ponder bigger pictures, however briefly, to willingly break the spell of their own film and trust in your ability to appreciate it on multiple levels simultaneously, almost as if to illustrate how history ebbs and flows through every moment, that we perpetually exist in that in-between, the intersection of the personal and societal. Mendonça Filho is even willing to let subtlety be damned, going back to that ironic title, that Armando finds himself trapped in a role that he is ill-equipped to play, that just navigating an oppressive state as someone who finds themselves at odds with it is a dangerous game where you are the prey, beautifully expressed in a tricksy sleight of filmmaking craft, Armando effectively superimposed on the trailer for a spy film, which may be a bit, hey, get it? But I'm in love with it. Particularly as the film is Le Magnifique. Not actually a spy film, but a film about a writer who fantasizes about a life as a spy. That the very idea that Armando could ever have the skills to escape this situation is a fantasy that can't even be truly reflected on the screen he is watching. That's very cute, and I think it's fair to say, obviously intentional, so let's quickly look at the other films Mendonça Filho has dropped in. Well, there's The Omen, and why would you use that? Well, maybe we could look at it as patriarchy and wealth providing a perfect platform for a manifestation of pure evil. Oh, this is fun. Hey look, there's a poster for The Front, a comedy drama set during the McCarthyite witch hunts against a communist boogeyman. People induced or forced into either giving up colleagues and friends to authoritarians, or paying a heavy toll themselves. These things are so small, but I'm in love with it. Hey, there's Brazilian Planet of the Apes, and you could just use Planet of the Apes here, an elite class dominating and dehumanizing a lesser class, but also Brazilian Planet of the Apes has a Jaws reference, so clearly that film was the cultural behemoth the secret agent paints it as. So, on to the big one, Jaws, referenced throughout the film and even serving as an embellishment to its narrative coda, so why is our focus so drawn to that film? Well, I'm going to sidestep the obvious, especially as we meet a shark in the film. So, I'd say it works best narratively as a reference to a common Marxist reading of Jaws, even overtly in the film's final lines. According to Peter Benchley's wife, Wendy, Cuban leader Fidel Castro was a big fan of the novel, seeing it as Marxist polemic, and it's not a stretch to see where he was coming from. The true villain of Jaws is not the shark. The shark is a natural disaster, a force of nature. The true villain of Jaws is the corrupt mayor and a state putting profit above human interest. According to this story, Castro saw the shark as representing capitalism because, of course he did, he's literally Fidel Castro. But for me, both more broadly and in this context, it works better if we think of it somewhat less abstractly. This apex predator dominion over the deep waters is pretty much literally violence and tyranny brought ever closer to the shore by the indifference of the profit motive. But either way, both the shark and the state are overcome in Jaws, by ordinary people working together, humanity enduring through corruption and violence, and ultimately defeating it by pooling resources through solidarity. Jaws isn't a film about a shark. Jaws is a film about people coming together in the face of adversity. Perhaps that is why Fernando no longer felt scared of the shark after seeing the Spielberg classic, as he tells us in the film's final lines. And if we accept this metaphor as intended, maybe that is because despite it costing him personally, he knew that together we can overcome anything, a mayor and a shark or a corrupt state and the violence it enacts and enables. And the film's big reveal that the blood bank Fernando now works at was the cinema from earlier in the film maybe suggests that these stories that gave him hope taught him that together we can help others and overcome adversity, manifested into a place where every day people make a small sacrifice of themselves to help someone they may never even meet. That ideas can become reality, that we can make the world a better place one day at a time. Blood transfusions into communities. The film does leave us with this comparatively hopeful if melancholic coda, following what I'm anecdotally aware was a polarizing choice. That while the film follows one man for over 2 hours, we are then effectively denied the actual resolution to that story, abruptly learning of Armando's death through a grainy scan of a microfiche. The matter-of-factness of this delivery and the sedate deflation of the film in the following 15 minutes is inviting you to sit with that moment. That was how that story ended. Maybe going through the stages of grief yourself. Maybe angry at the film for denying you resolution one way or another. Denial, we've seen that newspapers lie, there has to be more. Or bargaining, that perhaps Fernando will have one last revelatory story, one final flashback. Something, anything, but instead we sit with people who have accepted that tragedy. In the case of Fernando, perhaps molded by the idea, if not the memory, in a country that is itself in many ways still recovering from a tragedy, democratized but rife with inequality and corruption, its recent history showing that it's still in danger of falling for myths long thought debunked all over again. Now, there is a narrative rationalization for this way of concluding Armando's story, the film's framing device, that the tale we are being told is being recounted through first-hand testimony of those present, and no one who was present for his death exists to tell that tale. But that's not the reason for this choice. Structures aren't there to be slavishly adhered to, and, in fact, the secret agent breaks its structure multiple times. Say, for example, it's hard to believe that anyone on those tapes detailed the hiring of Augusto and Bobby, or them offing someone and tossing the body in a river. But this is not to nitpick, I simply don't care about that stuff. More to say that if Mendonça Filho wished to break the rules, he can and does. The intent is that feeling, that stories just end, often out of sight. And it wasn't intended quite this way, but watching this film in early 2026, how powerful it became that Armando's story ends with a news report. Just gone. A normal person thrust into a situation that required them to be a secret agent, by a corrupt state that normalizes violence, slandered by its supporters, the media obscuring as much as informing, somehow justifying their fate, a new reality everyone knows well enough is constructed, but which allows those who choose not to see, a fig leaf of rationalization or vindication. Tragedies grist for the ever-churning mythology mill, deaths to be debated as just or unjust, the stories of the people behind them too easily forgotten. In this instance, the real story is kept alive, Flavia handing Fernando a USB, a record of how Armando spoke and how others spoke of him. But in many ways, Armando's legacy will never be those words anyway. His legacy will be his son, Fernando. The relationship between Armando and Fernando isn't the only father-son dynamic in the film. Mirrored by Girotti and his son, Augusto and his stepson, Euclid and his sons, it's too many to simply be a narrative quirk, so why? Well, maybe we could be looking at something of a commentary on patriarchal structures. These three fathers, the businessman, the police captain, and the assassin, with their coarse reflections, power handed down as surely as the violence it begets. And in that context, perhaps there is something to the relative absence of women from this narrative, noticeably marginalized or missing, and that female characters also represent the vanguard of change, beacons of hope in a world fueled by the macho bullshit of authoritarianism and violence. It also suggests to me a dialogue on generations, that we are forged by those that make us both people and place, that what comes after is a reflection of before, that greed, authoritarianism, and cold violence, when handed down to the next generation, reflect back as surely as any mirror. So what of Armando and Fernando? How does their relationship stand in contrast when Fernando claims to barely remember his father? The two don't share many scenes, and when they do, they are framed very knowingly, a wall making a vast sea between them, or Armando cut out of shot. But there is one scene, my favourite scene in the film, the illicit car ride snuck by father and son, the only time in the film they truly interact, which subtly uses that trick of separating them or keeping them in shot together. And I feel that this is used to highlight when they are connecting, when a man's words become a boy's foundation, as well as being charmingly composed, not just precise but riffing on noir. It is such a beautifully written scene, ripe with backstory and foreshadowing, opening with the pair discussing the hairy leg. Armando jokes that the solution is to find the man it belongs to and reattach it, the engineer suggesting bolts or glue, but young Fernando, more empathetic, suggests sewing. As they move on to Fernando's late mother, Armando tells of the sickness that took her away, a tale that itself may or may not be apocryphal, Fernando taking an interest in the medical specifics. And these are the only times in the film and in this scene where the pair are in frame together, where influence flows. When Armando speaks more broadly about why they can't be together, they are again segmented, cut from each other's frames, that connection lost. The whole scene effectively the pair running but going round in circles, the inevitable as headlights in their rear windshield. And maybe one of the film's final shots reflects that too, as the researcher Flavia, upon learning of Amando's fate, looks upon her baby and his father, reminding a viewer that while an immutable past shapes us, it is just as sure that we shape the future, often in ways that are small, unseen, or forgotten. Our legacies those that come after, our influence felt whether through big screens, tape recordings, or just simple conversation. How did you speak? And how will others speak of you? Thank you very much for watching. If you listened to this, you made it all the way to the end, which is super cool of you. If you like this video, don't be scared to click on the like button, as that's literally what that means. You can also subscribe to see future videos. Comment below if you have anything to say about the Secret Agent or the way I butchered those pronunciations of Brazilian names. Thanks for watching. Hopefully I'll see you next time.